This podcast is a work of historical interpretation. While we strive for accuracy, some aspects of history are open to interpretation and debate. Thank you for listening. Probably not that much. I didn't screw up that bad.
A lot of the stuff I said?
Well, you should stop saying stuff you have to cut out all the time.
Why?
Welcome to Time Tellers, where we explore the defining moments of history. Today, we're recounting a tragedy that shook New York City and changed the course of labor rights in America. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out at the garment factory in Manhattan, resulting in the death of 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women. Dangerous working conditions, negligence, and greed fueled this accident and disaster.
Sounds like most accidents and disasters.
True. Join us as we unravel the events that led to the fire, the tragic day, and the consequences that transformed American labor laws. In the early 20th century, New York City's garment district... Okay.
Wow.
In the early 20th century, New York City's garment industry was booming, fueled by the demand for cheap, ready-made clothing. At the heart of this industry was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, located on 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Arch Building in Greenwich Village. The building was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, known as the Shirtwaist Kings, who employed hundreds of mostly young immigrant women, many as young as 14, primarily from Jewish and Italian communities. Women and children were hired at the Triangle Waistcoat Factory and similar workplaces in the early 20th century because they were seen as cheap, compliant force of labor. And these reasons are because women and children were paid significantly less than men, often earning only $7 to $12 a week for 12 to 14-hour days, making them highly cost-effective for factory owners. Women, especially immigrant women, had few job options and were often confined to low-wage industries such as textiles and garment production. The factory offered one of the few ways for them to earn a living, despite the unsafe and grueling conditions. Factory owners also believed that women and children would be more submissive and less likely to unionize or strike, making them easier to manage. Women were seen as more skilled in sewing, stitching, and finery, which were essential for quickly mass-producing shirtwaist. A shirtwaist is a women's dress with a seam at the waist. Its bodice incorporating a collar and buttons in the style of a shirt, so it resembles a shirt. It's a blouse. Okay.
A blouse is a shirt.
Yes. Yes, but that's what it is. Many women and children came from poor immigrant families and were often the primary breadwinners, driving them to accept dangerous, poorly paid work out of sheer necessity. Now let's talk about these conditions that they had to work under. Workers labored for 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for again around $7 to $12 weekly. At least the women. The factory was crowded with narrow aisles and no ventilation. Flammable materials like fabric scraps, lint, and paper patterns littered the floor, and smoking was expected, despite the high risk to fire. As I said earlier, the factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, with around 500 workers spread across these 3 floors. The 8th floor had approximately 200 workers, mainly involved in the initial stages of shirtwaist production, like cutting and sewing fabric. The 9th floor had about another 200 workers who were also on this floor assembling and finishing the shirtwaist. This floor had the highest number of casualty, as most workers were unaware of the fire until it was too late. And the 10th floor had about 100 workers, including the owners, managers, and clerical staff. The 10th floor had better roof access, allowing some to escape to neighboring buildings. The Triangle workers had been fighting for better conditions long before the fire. In 1909, many workers joined the uprising of the 2000. The uprising of the 2000 was a massive strike by female garment workers in New York City, beginning in November of 1909 in response to poor wages, unsafe conditions, and long hours in the shirtwaist industry. This included the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This strike was sparked by Clara Lamit's call for action, and again, over 20,000 predominantly Jewish and Italian immigrant women picketed in freezing conditions. They faced violence, arrest, and harassment. They were supported by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, and middle and upper class allies. The strike led to wage increases, shorter hours, and some safety improvements in around 300 factories. However, the Triangle Factory ignored key demands for safety. This is such a common thing. This happens so often, right? This is not the most uplifting story. Clara Lamich was a Ukrainian-born Jewish immigrant and labor activist who became a leading figure in the early 20th century American labor movement. After experiencing harsh conditions as a garment worker, she helped organize the uprising of 20,000 in 1909. She delivered a powerful speech that sparked a massive strike for the better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. And she would continue throughout her life to remain dedicated to workers' rights, women's suffrage, and social reform. Although the strike was successful in many ways, as mentioned before, Blank and Harris, the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, resisted change and even hired strikebreakers to disrupt protests.
Why would anybody do that?
To save money, to earn money, to keep their money. Money, money, money. At the Triangle Factory, the owners implemented strict measures to maximize productivity, often, again, at the expense of safety.
Who cares about safety?
Some of these implemented strict measures were exits that were locked during working hours to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks.
Yeah.
This also helped prevent union activity because nobody could get in either. Only one narrow staircase and a small elevator were used for entry and exit, making escape difficult. Not only escape during an emergency, but just like maneuvering in daily activity, I would think.
Well, why would you have to normally?
You don't think they didn't have to go between floors?
Not if everything was planned out properly. I mean, that's very inefficient.
Right, but they still had to get people onto the floors in a timely manner too, for each shift.
Yeah, don't have each shift start at the same time.
I don't know how their shifts work. There were no sprinklers or functional fire alarms, despite the high-risk environment. I don't know if there could be sprinklers at that time.
Yeah,
I'm sure they had something. On March 25th, 1911, these unsafe conditions collided most tragically. This is one of those moments in history that is so scary. Fire is scary to begin with. Just because you can imagine the terror and that is just, to die by fire is probably one of, if not the worst way to go. It was a typical Saturday shift. Around 4:40 p.m., a fire broke out on the 8th floor, likely caused by a cigarette butt or a match igniting the scrap fabric on the floor.
That's why smoking's bad for you.
One of the many reasons. Gas lights lit the factory, and while the gas lighting did not directly ignite the fire, their presence around, open flames in the factory increased the fire risk and made it worse. The fire spread rapidly within minutes due to all the inflammable material and strong winds from open windows, which I was slightly confused when I looked at this because they talked about not having ventilation, but I think they meant additional ventilation because the windows were partly open due to the lack of ventilation in the factory. So that was their only ventilation. And I guess it would depend on how many windows there were, how effective that was.
Was there 3.1 or 7 or 95 or 97?
I don't know.
Or XP?
Oh my gosh.
2000.
Funny. Took me a second, but I got it. That was funny.
Yeah, because I had to explain it to you.
Oh my gosh. I got it at about the time you said 97. As panic set in, workers on the 8th floor tried to escape through the only available exits, but doors were locked, trapping many inside. Those on the 9th floor were unaware of the fire until it was almost too late. The building had no audible alarm system, as I mentioned before, to warn them. The fire escape collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers. The fire escape at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was made of cheap, flimsy iron. It was poorly constructed and narrow, designed more for appearance than functionality. Its inadequate design and construction were significant factors in the high death toll during the fire.
Sounds like the Titanic lifeboats.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, didn't have enough lifeboats, right.
They were very inadequate.
Yeah. There were elevators, but 2 passenger elevators served the building, and only one was functional when the fire broke out.
Where was the other one?
It was there, it just wasn't working.
Why wasn't it working?
That's a good question. Why didn't they get it fixed? That's another good question.
Yeah.
And that would cost money. The elevator operator, Joseph Cito, made several heroic trips to the 9th floor, rescuing as many workers as possible. However, the elevators could only hold a few people at a time, and as the fire worsened, the heat warped the elevator cables, and debris clogged the shafts, making further rescues impossible. Desperate workers tried to slide down the cables or jump into the shafts, but many could not escape due to the fire's rapid spreading. Many workers had no choice but to jump from the windows in a desperate attempt to escape the flames, with crowds gathering on the streets below, horrified at the sight. The response to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was relatively swift, but challenges limited its effectiveness. Bystanders on the streets pulled fire alarms shortly after the fire was spotted around 4:40 p.m. Firefighters arrived within minutes, as the nearest fire station was only a few blocks away. The fire trucks that responded to the fire were horse-drawn wagons, which were still commonly used by fire departments in 1911. These wagons carried their firefighting equipment, water hoses, and ladders. Despite the rapid response, fire trucks struggled with blocked streets and heavy traffic, which delayed them getting to the scene and having access to the scene. I don't know if they had I'm sure they had some sort of siren of some sort, but I don't know if people would have gotten out of the way like we so commonly do today.
I mean, they should have.
I mean, I would hope, yes. Maybe there's nowhere to go.
If you don't get out of the way, then you should be held liable for any damage that you caused by not moving out of the way.
Yes, but we do have to remember this was 1911. Once there, firefighters faced significant challenges. Their ladders only reached the 6th floor. The nets used to catch jumpers were ineffective, tearing or collapsing under the impact, but they did attempt to catch.
It should have been adequate enough for at least one at a time.
Right, but how do you control people in a panic situation to jump only one at a time? Despite the quick arrival, the lack of proper equipment, and the overwhelming intensity of the fire was controlled within 30 minutes. They had to focus on controlling the blaze rather than evacuating the workers due to the intensity of the fire and the lack of being able to reach them. The Triangle Fire claimed 146 lives, including many young women who were the breadwinners for their families. Some victims were as young as 14. In addition to the 146 fatalities, approximately 78 people were injured. Injuries ranged from burns and smoke inhalation to severe injuries from jumping or trying to escape down the building's exterior. Many of the survivors were left with long-term physical and emotional trauma from the incident. I don't know if I'd ever be able to go into another building again.
Sure you would.
I'd be looking for all the exits, I can tell you that. I mean, not that I don't already do that, but... The fire's aftermath spurred a public outcry and led to significant consequences. Tens of thousands attended the mass funerals for the victims, and outraged citizens participated in marches demanding change. But nobody listened. Like, come on. This could have been prevented. This was a preventable, at least, not necessarily the fire itself, but the amount of deaths could have been significantly lowered with just a few small safety changes. The tragedy symbolized labor struggles, galvanizing both workers and reformers. There was a victims' funeral procession held for the victims. It drew tens of thousands of mourners, including workers, labor activists, and citizens. It became an expression of grief and a symbol of solidarity and focused on the need for labor reform. In response to the fire, New York State established the Factory Investigating Commission, led by future political figures like Frances Perkins and Al Smith. Frances Perkins is a very interesting character, and we should definitely do an episode on her, possibly during, I'm thinking, March for Women's History Month. Her advocacy work following the fire, laid the foundation for her later role as the U.S. Secretary of Labor under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. There, she became the first woman to hold a cabinet position and was a major architect of the New Deal. Al Smith. Smith's commitment to labor reform following the Triangle Fire significantly shaped his political career. He eventually served as the governor of New York, where he continued to advocate for progressive labor laws.
Yay.
He would also go on to run for president. And that's where the Al Smith dinner comes from still, that they do today. That's that Al Smith. The commission...
So why did they name the dinner?
Because he started it.
Oh.
Like, that was, yeah.
Wow.
The commission conducted thorough inspections of factory conditions across the state of New York, uncovering numerous safety violations and advocating for comprehensive labor reforms and an overhaul of so many things. Over the next few years, more than 30 new labor laws were enacted in New York, addressing fire safety, building codes, working hours, and child labor. Mandatory fire drills was one of the fire safety improvements for factories employing more than 25 workers. They are required to install sprinkler systems in buildings over 7 stories high, so there was some sort of system they could install back then. There was a requirement for unobstructed exits, including multiple exits, not just one anymore, and unlocked doors during working hours, and fireproof stairwells, which is something we still see today, like all of this. There were building code reforms established to ensure better construction standards, such as the fire-resistant materials and the adequate emergency exits, and improved fire escapes that could withstand more significant weight and pressure.
Yay.
Like, why do bad things have to happen to have good things happen? I don't understand. They also improved ventilation systems to reduce hazards like dust and fumes, which addressed broader concerns about workers' health in general, because working around all these fumes and dust and whatnot is not good for a person.
Really? I didn't know that.
I know, it's shocking. Regulations required proper lighting, sanitation, and clean drinking water in factories. Like, they didn't have clean drinking water? Like, what? And then, of course, we have the labor for children, child labor restrictions, right? The stricter limits on child labor, including a minimum age for employment, and limits on the number of hours children could work, also started to develop after this disaster. And that's been changed multiple times, and each state is a little different. But
that's another thing that should be controlled federally that's not.
Like in Pennsylvania, you can start working at 14, but there's only limited hours. I mean, you have to get, like, permission from the school, like, get your working papers to do that. At 16, you can work a little more hours, but not completely. And then, of course, there's only certain jobs you can do until you're 18. Like, you can't sell alcohol until you're 18.
Sure you can, just not in the state?
I'm talking about the state of Pennsylvania.
Oh,
Yeah, specifically, because those are the laws I know as having teenagers.
Because they wanted to go sell alcohol?
No, but my oldest, they're going to train her up to be a bartender now.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Legislation reduced the maximum work week for women to 54 hours and for men, 60.
What about equality?
I don't think that's still, stands. I don't think that's still a thing. Provisions for seating, rest breaks, and meal periods for workers was also starting to be established after this. And of course, these are things that have gone through multiple changes since then, and they are all dependent on states. Different states have different laws, right? Establishment of the Factory Investigation Commission to regularly inspect workplace for compliancy with new safety laws that would continue after this. They would continue to check on factories to make sure they were following the rules, which is good because you have to have enforcement. Creating a more robust State Department of Labor also helped enforce these laws and provided resources for ongoing worker safety. These laws became a model for national labor reform, laying the groundwork for the New Deal reforms of the 1930s during the Great Depression. The fire reignited the efforts of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, which strengthened workers' rights and advocated for safer work environments. Now they had a good reason. They're like, look what just happened. Listen to us. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point in American labor history. It exposed the exploitation of immigrant workers, the dangers of unregulated industries, and the urgent need for at least some government oversight. The lives lost in the fire weren't in vain. They paved the way for safer, fairer workplaces for future generations. Which I guess is a silver lining. I mean, like I said, a lot of this could have been prevented. A lot of tragedies and accidents and stuff like this can be prevented, but people don't for monetary reasons most of the time, or ignorance,
or both.
Yeah. The Triangle Fire reminds us that behind every tragedy lies a lesson. It's a story of loss, but also of resilience and reform. Thanks to the brave workers and the reformers who followed, labor laws were changed to protect the most vulnerable. And the elevator operator, we had some heroes show up and try, and the firefighters, of course, try their very best to get people out. In fact, the last living survivor of this fire was Rose Friedman, who died in Beverly Hills, California on February 15, 2001, and she lived to be the age of 107. But Friedman escaped the inferno by stopping to consider what the executives were doing. She somehow thought they would be safer and went up to the 10th floor, where their offices were, to find out. And they were taking the freight elevator to the roof, where firefighters pulled them to the roof of an adjacent building. So that's how she survived that fire. And the youngest victim, I mentioned they were 14. Their names were Kate Leone and Rosaria Sarah Maltese. The oldest victim was 43. Her name was Provincia Pano, but most were the ages of 14 to 23. Despite the deaths, the factory reopened 3 days later in the same building. What? And that building does still stand. Today, you can go see it. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were acquitted for manslaughter, but were later brought back to court for civil suits. They eventually settled and paid $75 per death. I mean, that was $75 in that time period's money, not today. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory does still stand, as I stated, and it's at 2329 Washington Place beside Washington Square Park in Manhattan. It's now called the Brown Building and is part of the New York University campus. So let us remember these victims as a catalyst for change in the fight for workers' rights. That's all for this episode, Time Tellers. If you found this story compelling, please follow us, leave us a review, maybe even a 5-star, even for this very sad episode. And join us next time as we uncover another pivotal historical moment in our American history.